All right, here are some slides for Unit 4. The area of Unit 4 that our text is not the greatest in, it has some big gaps, is in heavy metal. So I do encourage you to watch the heavy metal film that is put in your campus course before going through the slides to study for the music. It will give you a good background and a basis. We're going to do mainly just pioneers in this unit of heavy metal. The rest of Unit 4 is really a bit of a mishmash. It's not particularly in a chronological setting, nor a stylistic setting. There's quite opposing styles. It's just dabbling in a few of the elements that change throughout the 80s and 90s, and we only get to about the late 90s in this course. Keep that in mind. So hang on, because it's a little bit of a ride. So the first group in the heavy metal category is firmly in the heavy metal category is Black Sabbath. And again, please watch the film. They are featured fairly prominently in the beginning of it as solidly heavy metal, the godfathers of heavy metal. They don't shy away from the term like Led Zeppelin did. We talked about them in the last unit. They were loved and hated by the music press and the critics. That's probably why their only top 10 in the UK is this song Paranoid. They were really embraced in the United States more, especially once they got a little more listenership. In the film, there's a description, and Tony Iommi, it says Iommi's finger accident here. Tony Iommi is this gentleman here, and he is the lead guitarist for Black Sabbath who has an accident with his finger. He will describe that in detail for you in the film. But that does contribute to a heavy sound for Sabbath's guitar work, which becomes almost a stereotypical sound for some early heavy metal in particular. There are strong backbeats in this particular song. There's a lot of distortion with the use of fuzz tone and various different effects. And really the themes of Paranoid are on mental illness. So pause and take a listen and come back when you're done. The next group is also English, but notice they are considered second wave British heavy metal. There we go, my little red pen. They're slightly younger. They come out a little bit on the coattails of some of the pioneers, like a Black Sabbath, like a Deep Purple. They have a little musical difference, and they have some image differences, because by the time they are more in the scene, they're going head to head with some of the punk rock bands of England as well. They're interesting in their use of dual guitars, which actually becomes another kind of stereotype, almost a cliche of later heavy metal. They also use some dual drum work, but they were inspired a lot by the previous band we talked about in Unit 3, the Allman Brothers. And it might seem like completely two different worlds, Southern rock and British heavy metal, but they really surprisingly share a lot of musical inspiration that is similar. Their images are completely different, their audiences are completely different, and of course their sound and intensity is very different. But they did find that dual lead guitar work of Allman Brothers very inspiring. The themes are women, obsession, and alcoholism, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, nothing particularly deep. So take a listen to Victim of Changes. One caution, there's a very long lead-in to this song, meaning it starts with almost total silence and slowly builds, which we call a crescendo. Don't think you got the track wrong. Wait a minute or two, because the dual lead guitars kind of swirl in as if they're flying through your consciousness from a faraway distance. Come back when you're done listening. So the Americans were not alone or absent. The film is made by an English company, the BBC, and it does highlight a lot of the British heavy metal sound. But America was definitely dabbling in different hard rock sounds and creating its own version of heavy metal. And this gentleman represents what's called heavy metal theater. This is Alice Cooper, whose real name is Vince Furnier. The character is Alice Cooper, who on stage was highly theatrical with all kinds of costumes, live snakes. He simulated his own death numerous times a night, or at least once a night. Numerous performances when he'd have a guillotine on stage or a noose to hang himself. Very, very grim, very shocking for the time. You know, look how early this is. This is 1972. And his music is not, I'm not trying to put it down, but it's not particularly complicated. It's really his theatrical performances that go into making up the whole of who Alice Cooper was and is. He did absolutely influence future shock rockers like Marilyn Manson. Even early Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails would show up very shockingly in his live performances as well. But Alice Cooper is one of the first. The song School's Out is not, again, a very complicated song, but it's very popular. And you can imagine that the balance between this creepy guy and little children, he actually has little children in the recording, and actually some of the lip-synced performances on television from the time period showed a few school-age kids on the stage with him. That would have been a huge shock to teachers and principals and parents and mayors of cities, and so this, you know, being able to shock the world was quite exciting for someone like Alice Cooper. There's not a disconnect completely with the early Chuck Berry song about school being out. That idea that we are free and there's excitement at the end of a school day. It runs the same through Alice Cooper's version, but there's no musical similarities, there's no lyric similarities, there's no chord similarities, but there may be a slight homage to that connecting to school. So listen to, or maybe if you can find it, watch Alice Cooper on YouTube perform School's Out and come back. The next American group is a little more commercial in its approach. Didn't have anywhere near the theatrics of an Alice Cooper, or even the image of Black Sabbath, or even Judas Priest with all of the leather and the studs. They are the Van Halen brothers and family friend or cousin. I believe there's a cousin involved there. Van Halen, who in this instance has a really interesting cover version of a Kinks song, You Really Got Me Going, that we experienced in the British Invasion section of Unit 2. So please remind yourselves of what the Kinks version sounds like. And I caution you to try to find the studio version from the early 60s. It may be a mono version rather than stereo. That's very likely. But it has that kind of chunky sounding fuzz tone that they created, if you remember the story, by actually putting blades and cutting their amp speakers to get that fuzzy quality that was later on would be a pedal you could buy or an effect that you can use on your electric guitar. Then compare it to the Van Halen from '78. You're going to have more virtuosity, which is what Van Halen really, really was known for, was incredible musicianship, incredible playing. Their frontman at the time is David Lee Roth, and he's pictured, if you're looking at the screen, to your left with the long flowing blonde hair. He was quite a character. He had his whoops and his hollers and his squeals in his vocal treatment of the song. He would dance around on stage, very high energy. There's not a huge musical difference between them. The tempos are approximately the same. I believe the key is the same. There's not any big differences other than that really obvious difference in modernization with better musicianship with Van Halen's guitar work, and a little bit of an emphasis on the lyric here. I put this here. It's very subtle, so don't worry if you don't exactly hear it. I put slightly. The David Lee Roth emphasizes the lyric ever so slightly differently, but it's a pretty subtle difference. So compare the two and come on back. We go back to England for our next group, Iron Maiden. They are yet a third wave, I guess we can call it a wave, of heavy metal, younger than Judas Priest and far younger than Black Sabbath and some of the pioneers of the earlier time period. And they are in a category that's mentioned in the heavy metal film pretty quickly, and it's the acronym is listed here. NWOBHM stands for New wave of British heavy metal. It's important because there's a couple of buzz terms in there. New wave is a whole different genre created by the commercial side of music, mostly by itself when it's used in that context. British heavy metal, without all the other words before it, is a huge category that can encompass everybody from Sabbath to Maiden to anybody in the current style. But when you put them together, new wave of British heavy metal, you're talking about a specific time period, a specific style of production, one could say. The music is a little more intense, and in the hands of Iron Maiden, much more theatrical because of their second lead singer and their main lead singer that most people know about, Bruce Dickinson. Steve Harris created the band, and in interviews he denies this, but I want to explain it. The new wave of British heavy metal has in it some of the do-it-yourself ideas, business practices, not using traditional lines of distribution and things that also punk had, that really also independent records of the 50s had. DIY, do it yourself. So in Iron Maiden's earliest Soundhouse recordings, they did it themselves. They fronted the money to have it recorded. They distributed it themselves. They advertised it themselves. And that was very much the same as some of the underground punk movement, particularly the New York scene when it was very grassroots. Steve Harris has said in interviews he has absolutely nothing to do with punk rock. He couldn't stand punk rock. He was adamant that there was nothing about Iron Maiden that was punk. And I agree with him when it comes to the musical component, but how they started as a very almost out of their backyards idea, that has something in common. So they're both kind of right, but I'm not trying to insinuate that the sound of Iron Maiden is punk in any way. The song itself, Number of the Beast, quotes from the book of Revelation as well as other sections of the Bible. It has a very creepy beginning with a narrator talking about the number of the beast. And then pretty quickly in the beginning, Bruce Dickinson has a huge scream. And this is a result of multiple tracks and takes over and over and over. And he was getting super, super frustrated. And they kept the most frustrated scream. The lot of operatic quality to the way Bruce Dickinson uses his voice, not only on this track, but on a lot of Iron Maiden. He really could have sung opera. Take a pause and creep yourself out. This guy on the back here, you can't see him very well. He is Eddie. He becomes one of the iconic cartoony figures of Iron Maiden's entire output. So listen to Number of the Beast and come on back. We go back to the United States for yet another wave of metal leaders here. This is Metallica, based off of the Bay Area, but I know that James Hetfield's family is from the Downey area. But Lars, the drummer, or Ehrlich, I think is how it's pronounced, basically formed the band in the Bay Area of California. They are even younger than the other bands that we've mentioned and talked about so far. They are in a category called thrash metal, and that's also somewhat synonymous, although people argue this all the time, with a term called speed metal. Again, if you've watched the heavy metal film, they are juxtaposed, almost kind of Hatfields and McCoys with the LA glam metal scene. They didn't want to have anything to do with that. They didn't identify with it. They didn't think their music was the same. They weren't into the same image that the glam metal bands from the film were into. They, in the early days, played very high speed, driving, forceful, heavy guitar-centered music, which is really what speed metal or thrash metal really means. If you're watching the film, you'll see that they evolve into something a little more powerful, slower, and like any band and any artist, they're not stuck into one particular style of creating music, hopefully. The term power chords is showing up on this slide, and to give you just a really simple definition, there are different ways that one can play a chord which is multiple notes at one time, on a guitar. And the more powerful chords come from a certain order of the way the notes are played. I don't want to get too specific. Power chords are actually present in punk rock as well. They're really present in The Who. They actually sometimes get a subtitle as the godfathers of sort of power chords. The Who, the British group from Unit 2. What's really also interesting about Master of Puppets, not only its themes of the puppet master being the drug addiction of the character in the story, and I believe Hetfield, this gentleman here, here he is, wrote the lyrics to this. I'd have to double check, but he's mostly the lyric writer for the band. But it's also the structure of the song, starting out fast and furious and lots of intense rhythms in the first section, and then it drops down to almost a power ballad style for the middle section, and then ramps right up again to the faster section at the end. It's quite a long song. I haven't clocked it recently, but I think it's close to 7 or 8 minutes, depending on how much of it you listen to. So listen to some of Master of Puppets, and please come back. Okay. Now this chart is not anything you need to print out and study or try to even read very well. It's awfully small, but it's one of dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of charts about heavy metal and hard rock history, as it's titled up there. This is something scholars of this style of music, are constantly arguing about. Which categories, which subcategories, what are influencing, what are not. Oh my gosh, that band, Black Sabbath, shouldn't be in this category, or Led Zeppelin shouldn't be over here, or they're constantly battling it. My point in putting it in the slideshow is to illustrate how absolutely complicated heavy metal is. And its origins are very rich, and it really, really does deserve a whole semester of treatment, of study. Run in a 4-year institution, that would very likely, and I know that it does happen. The documentary that I selected for class, and it would have been the same one I would have shown you in person, is the one you hopefully have already watched, is brief. It is less than an hour. It's a really general overview of a few of the styles. If you are an enthusiast, and even if you're not and you want a little more, both of the film projects by a director named Sam Dunn, D-U-N-N, are excellent. He's, I believe, Canadian, but he's an anthropology major. So he approaches the analysis of this music he always loved from his anthropology background, and diving into the origins and categorization and analysis, and it's quite thorough. One of the documentaries is called Heavy Metal, A Headbanger's Journey. It's a couple hours long, so it's, but he's got great footage of some of the festivals and Norwegian, Scandinavian heavy metal, black metal festivals, stuff in the United States, of course, and then he gets to interview some of the pioneers. He also directed a series that used to be on Amazon, I haven't checked lately, called Metal Evolution, and each chapter was devoted to a specific category. So he starts with origins, and he might focus on glam metal in one chapter later on. He might focus on black metal or death metal or some other thrash metal, So if you're interested, check those out. I don't know if they are available free. I doubt it, but you all have ways to search the internet. So we're going to end part 1 here, and then we're going to jump back in with the importance of MTV and some of the music surrounding that for part 2. So I'll see you all in part 2.